Widen your horizons. NHK World Japan.
See it now, over the air and on Comcast and Verizon.
Occasionally, I have something to say, but the word I want is lost and comes out wrong.
CCBC Continuing Education, customized training. Whether you're a business, nonprofit, or government agency, look to CCBC for all your training needs. 443-840-5200.
My family has been proud supporters and donors of Barks. As pet owners, we're well aware of the challenges that pets face, especially in the wintertime. J.F. Fisher has decided to partner with Barks in addition to our business relationship, maintaining their HVAC systems and plumbing systems. We wanted to do something to make our employees proud of us, so we decided to make the donation from a company level.
State Circle is made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities and is made possible by the generous support of our members. Thank you.
Connecting Marylanders to their government. This is State Circle.
Good evening. Welcome to State Circle. It is Christmas in August for regional planners and for the people about to draw Maryland's new political maps. The census results are out, and among the findings, Maryland is now the most diverse state on the East Coast. With more insights on big population moves, here's MPT's Nancy Yamada.
The once-in-a-decade head count shows Maryland's population grew by 7% to a total of nearly 6.2 million people. County by county, the largest growth was seen in Frederick County. Population there grew by 16.4%, followed by Howard County, which saw a 15.8% increase, followed by Charles County, which grew by more than 13%. The largest county in Maryland is still Montgomery County, with its population now topping 1 million. But a look at the numbers show more people are moving out of Baltimore City. For the first time in a century, the city's population is below 600,000. 586,000 people still call Baltimore City home, but that's down by 5.7%. Even more dramatic declines were seen in western Maryland and the Eastern Shore. Allegheny County lost 9.3% of its population. Somerset County saw a 7% drop, followed by Kent County with an almost 5% decrease. A broader look at the numbers show Maryland is no longer a majority white state. The state's white population that doesn't identify as Hispanic was 47% in 2020, down from 55% in 2010. While not the majority, whites are still the largest racial group, followed by blacks, who make up 29% of the population. That remains unchanged since 2010. And the share of Marylanders who identify as two or more races doubled to more than 4%. I'm Nancy Yamada for State Circle.
Nancy, thank you. Joining us now for some insights on what the data mean for the future of our region, Seema Iyer, Associate Director of the Jacob France Institute at the University of Baltimore, and Jeanette Chapman, Director of the Stephen S. Fuller Institute for Research on the Washington Region's Economic Future at George Mason University. Thank you both for joining us. To begin with, let me just give you a blank slate question. When you look at the numbers that you've seen so far, Jeanette, first, tell me what stands out for you.
Population growth has slowed nationally, and that's also true within the Washington region. That's going to be the main top line narrative that comes out of all of the population numbers in most places in the United States. The slowing population growth typically corresponds with economic growth as well, and so many places have had a taper down in some of their economic numbers prior to the pandemic.
And Seema, what jumps out for you?
What stood out dramatically was the population loss that actually was occurring in counties that were smaller than 50,000 persons or less, which of course happens in every state, but it predominates throughout the entire Midwest and middle section of the country. And what a gain we had in this decade for metropolitan areas and cities in particular, and cities up and down the East Coast. Philadelphia posted its biggest gain in population in the last 70 years. It grew by 5%. And it was really a win for cities in this decade.
With the exception of the city where you work.
With the unfortunate exception of Baltimore, but I feel like that should be our clarion call. We clearly are sitting in a backward trend along our sister cities here on the East Coast, including obviously Washington, D.C., that's posted such great gains. And we should be able to learn from what's going on in these other cities and bring that here to Baltimore.
Well, to stay on this for a second, when you look up the road at Philadelphia, which has so many similarities with Baltimore, but is of course a much bigger city and it's a much bigger metro area, why was the population up there and down here?
I mean, that's something that we've got to wrestle with because, it's not just Philadelphia, which is a much bigger city. So maybe that kind of gravity pull that big cities can have, like New York grew by 7%, Boston grew, Washington obviously grew, but even the smaller cities along the East Coast grew, like Newark, New Jersey, and Richmond, which have very similar situation to Baltimore, grew by more than 10 percentage points. So there is something that they are doing right that we need to figure out. And it's probably not one thing, it's probably a series of things that they're doing that we need to bring to a city like Baltimore.
Well, you think about what the big economic drivers have been. Baltimore was a manufacturing town. A lot of those jobs left over the past couple of decades. Jeanette, when I think about Washington, I think company town with the federal government. The slowness of the growth, although still positive, what does that say?
Firstly, it's in line with national patterns. So in some ways, it's not all that unique. And in the Washington metropolitan region overall, our growth still was faster than the national growth. And as Seema pointed out, the District of Columbia proper had extremely fast growth. It increased by 14.6%. And that was actually the fastest growth of these major sub-state areas in the region. And that's the first time that's happened since really the 1930s. So there's been a reversal in the geographic distribution of the population gains within the past decade.
Demographic data changing substantially in the district itself. What's happening there?
In the district itself, essentially what's happened is between 1950 and roughly 2000, the district proper had population declines. And it was a slow attrition with the exception of the 1970s where population had a pretty rapid decrease. Since 2000, that trend has reversed. The 2000 to 2010 growth was relatively modest. And then this 2010 to 2020 period, it picked up quite a lot. And some of this has to do with the changing infrastructure and on the ground built space environment of the district. Some of this does also have to change due to changes in these big demographic bubbles. Millennials are the most talked about in this story. Millennials are now almost 40 years old as of the 2020 census. And so the oldest of that age cohort has kind of pushed through their inner city years, and we'll start to see them cycle out as in the next probably decade or so.
The whole process of the census, acquiring the data, crunching the data, disseminating it, it's almost quaint when you think about the world of instantaneous information that we live in. There's so much data. I mean, when the Constitution set up a process for a census every decade, it was generating a lot of unique data. Now we live in a world where every year we're generating more total data than has ever been generated in the history of mankind. So I wonder how accurate this is. Does it all fit with what we know from other sources?
Well, I will actually push back a little bit against the proliferation of data as being a universally additive component to our knowledge base. We get a lot of information, but we don't necessarily know what percentage of the population, say, it covers. So a lot of it's incomplete. And the decennial census is designed to fill that completeness gap. And it is a total count of all people everywhere at a static point in time as of April 1st. And that actually is it provides a lot more nuance than people may realize, because we're used to getting data sets that are a little bit more fluid. And so I think that the value of the decennial census is quite significant, even with the proliferation of other data sources. And the challenges with this year in particular have been extremely large. So the pandemic and some of the methodology changes have made that a little bit harder to compare with prior years. But in general, the decennial census is the gold standard of data collection.
Seema, feel free to jump in on this, because I know there's a concern in Baltimore that maybe there was an undercount of people in the city who, for whatever reason, weren't reached, or maybe immigrants who didn't want to communicate more than they absolutely had to. So what I was thinking in terms of data was that Verizon and T-Mobile and AT&T, they know how many phones are spending the night in which zip codes every night. I mean, they know exactly. So you wonder how that compares to what the census reported.
No, I totally agree with Jeanette that the census is our best case scenario for looking at the major figure, which is how many people live in a particular place at one particular time. And even those other data sets really won't get at that. Like the other day, children under 5 don't typically have phones, right? So we wouldn't be able to count children with those types of things. And so the census has a huge job to do to count all kinds of different people, all kinds of different ages. And of course, over the last 200 years, the Census Bureau has gotten good at that. Unfortunately, 2020 was a highly unusual year to try and catch people in the normal enumeration kind of standards. So there's probably a little bit of potential undercounting here and there, but if you look at the trends, I don't think we can argue with what we're seeing. The city of Baltimore lost population, whether they lost the 35,000 that we think the census enumerated, or the 33,000 or the 30,000 we might quibble about. But if you look at where we have lost population, we're losing it in neighborhoods that we have seen losing population. And in some of our neighborhoods, we actually showed a huge increase in Hispanic neighborhoods in the city of Baltimore. So when we think about undercounting, we actually saw huge gains in what we have as high Hispanic neighborhoods. So we have to drill down. It's only a week since we got this information. We do have to drill down and look for potential anomalies and what their enumeration has told us. But I totally agree that the census is the best time that we get this information. And now we are going to start analyzing it.
To what degree do you, oh, please go ahead.
It's also part of a bigger process, because the jurisdictions do get the opportunity to discuss these numbers with the census, bringing all of the data that you mentioned, everything from water hookups to energy usage that they may collect internally. And so over the next few years, there may be a little bit of changes to these numbers as these anomalies are identified.
How much of the pandemic was captured? The movement of people, those fortunate to have second homes, a lot of them spent their time there if they could work remotely. The snapshot is capturing people during the move, before it, after it. What do you think we saw?
Well, I think we thought, we were very nervous that we would have seen the emptying out of cities. And that's exactly what we didn't see. In fact, the opposite was true. We saw kind of the repopulation of cities. So hopefully maybe by April 1st, we saw people where they were before they went to their summer home. And so maybe that is a little bit, but I think the trend is on point, that this was definitely the decade for cities. And if we, like a city like Baltimore, has to figure out what do we need to do to turn our own trend around. And we're not a city like, a Cleveland or a Detroit that actually did post severe population losses even in this decade. We have extreme locational advantages, being 45 minutes away from the nation's capital, and being right on the port, and being right on the water, and being along the I-95 corridor. So we should take advantage of that as we move forward.
And Jeanette Chapman, thank you so much. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Joining us now for the Political Roundtable are Malia Cromer, Director of the Sarah T. Hughes Field Politics Center at Goucher College, and CCBC Political Science Professor John Deedy. Thank you both for joining us.
You're welcome.
Thanks for having me.
So we've been talking about the new census numbers sort of from a planning or academic standpoint. Now we want to look at it from a raw politics standpoint. These are the numbers that set up the process, which ultimately is going to mean many of our viewers get a new representative in Annapolis, maybe a new member of Congress. And I'm sure you will both agree that this is going to be a completely apolitical, bipartisan process.
This is going to be a political warfare. And it's going to be an interesting warfare in this respect, because the last redrawing was gerrymandered to death. The 3rd district was an abomination. And the way Governor O'Malley drew the districts, and previously under Governor Glendening, they were really partisan in many ways. And the one interesting aspect I'm going to be looking at is how the 1st district is drawn. It is with Andy Harris. He's the only Republican. But the problem is this: his district has bled population. So they have to add people to his district. The problem is the areas they would add them to, either the old 1st district of Anne Arundel County or parts of Baltimore County, would be heavily Democratic, which would help any candidate running against Harris in the general election.
All right, to further set up the congressional districts, Maryland gets and will continue to have 8 members to the House of Representatives. It's currently 7-1 Democrats to the 1 Republican in the 1st district. Republicans dream of getting a 2nd seat back. Dr. Cromer, can the Democrats dream of pitching a shutout, having an 8-0 congressional delegation?
Well, I think what's good for the Democrats right now, if they are able to get through a map that does make the 1st district a little bit more competitive for Democrats, they have an all-star candidate in Heather Mazier. So she's somebody who's been racking up endorsements from establishment Democrats across the state. And she's somebody who I think has that unique ability to bridge sort of progressive politics in a way that actually appeals to some moderate Democrats as well. And that's a rare thing, I think, for especially a staunchly progressive candidate like Mazier to be able to do. And she also has the ability to raise money. So she has some national connections. So she, as an individual, could make that race competitive if the district lines could be drawn in a way that allows some more Democratic voters into that district.
And 10 years ago, the last time the map was redrawn, the powers that be were able to cram every Republican they could into that district to try to make it easier for Democrats to win elsewhere in the state. Do you see it getting more competitive? The numbers are, you need about 800,000 people to have a congressional district. The Eastern Shore is about 450,000 people. So you got to come across the Susquehanna or the Chesapeake to the Western Shore to pick up 300 and some thousand voters someplace.
And the one thing is, for picking them up, and I mentioned this a little bit before, part of that district already covers parts of Baltimore County, the eastern part. They're going to have to find more people. And there's been a big push to really bring back some of Anne Arundel County related to the Annapolis area into that district. Also, if you're going to bring more Baltimore County, do you go a little bit further north towards, Rosedale, maybe even near Towson, which might be pushing it a little bit. But I think they're going to go that way. The thing that Andy Harris has a big disadvantage in is he's not well liked among Republicans and Democrats. There may be more of an interest behind saying for Republicans, we'll give you that Western Maryland district. We'll draw that for you, but we want to get rid of this guy. And I think there's a few Republicans, Andy Harris and Governor Hogan don't have a big love affair. So there may be a lot of Hogan Republicans that would like to say to Andy Harris, sorry, we couldn't help you.
This is the first time in, I think, 70 years that Maryland is going to have a redistricting process with a Republican in the governor's office. And the question is, how strong will the governor be? The mechanics are different for legislative and congressional redistricting. Congressional is just a piece of legislation through the General Assembly. The governor can veto it. The legislature can override the veto. Although Democrats have to be nearly completely unified to overturn a veto, which they have been doing routinely.
I don't think there's any question that they would be able to muster the unity to overturn a veto. But I think the difference is that Hogan is really good at messaging these types of issues to the public at large. We have polled on redistricting reform in the past, and a significant majority of Marylanders would like to see the legislature or the politics taken out of redistricting and putting in the hands of an independent commission, which is something the governor has certainly advocated for during his time in office. And so I think that will be that's where he'll have his strength relative to the Democrats. And again, you see him assembling his own redistricting commission, and the Democrats in the General Assembly have formed their redistricting commission. And it'll be interesting to see where the differences between those maps sort of shake out when they're presented.
Does anybody politically ever pay a price for gerrymandering? I mean, there's a lot of tut-tutting, and the polls say, voters don't want that. They want, independent, fair maps. But in reality, the people in power, if they have an opportunity to gerrymander something, they do it. And do they ever get hurt for that?
Really, when I've looked at it historically, there's not a big price to pay. If you get through that first election for the person running, you're fine. And generally, by the time you redraw 10 years later, most of the people there are already gone. And Malia made a great comment about Hogan and messaging on this issue. He owns it. He has the moral high ground to look down upon Democrats. So if he puts out a plan that looks fair to people, it's going to be hard for Democrats to say, well, here's our plan. And yeah, it looks a little gerrymandered, but we have the numbers. And moral high ground is sometimes a better place to be. And it may force the Democrats to say to Hogan, we'll make you a deal. We'll give you your congressional map. Just don't fight us on the state maps.
And I guess the question is he really running for president? And if he's going to be running in Republican primaries, being able to say that I got us an extra, congressional seat in Maryland, a 100% increase in the number of Republicans in Congress from Maryland would look pretty substantial.
Perhaps. I don't know. Again, I don't know if these sorts of issues would drive Republican primary voters to a Hogan presidency. But I do think it's important to note that, there's the politics of it, and then there's actually the small d democracy part of this. Gerrymandering is a scourge on our American electoral system. It creates elections where the primary becomes more important than the general, which drives ideological extremism. And it's really it's one of the issues that it's fundamentally at the root of the problems we have with our democracy right now. And so
it was interesting. I mean, the current Maryland congressional map was in the Supreme Court a few years ago. And the justices as a group looked at it and said, yeah, this is terrible, but we don't have a way to fix it. So, there are really no limits on gerrymandering.
And that's unfortunate that there's no limits on it. And really, the Supreme Court in that decision punted the decision away. And it really leaves it as a more of a political process. As far as Governor Hogan and maybe this helping his presidential prospects, nothing will help his presidential prospects because the party has been successfully hijacked by the Trump wing. I just don't see him having any possibility of getting elected president just because that wing is now so dominant. The Republican Party's not going back to what we remember even in the Bush era.
Malia, before we go here, I wanted to get your thoughts. The Speaker of the House is backing a referendum on legalizing marijuana in Maryland. This is an issue that you've been polling at Goucher for years. How would that fly with voters?
Well, if our polling is any indication of where the public is at, they strongly support the legalization of recreational marijuana. We've been asking about this since back in 2013. Our most recent poll in February showed that around 67% of Marylanders supported it. And for the first time, even 50% of Republicans supported it. Now, of course, the issue has not faced sort of outside interest group pushback yet. And so there would certainly be some messaging for the folks who are against legalization. I think the big thing to look for is not whether it's going to pass, but what other issues along with it pass. Like, are they going to, will the legislature put expungement of criminal records associated with marijuana use as part of that package? So there are some criminal justice issues that will certainly surround the legalization process. And that to me is the really big thing to look for, because polling indicates that it will pass at the ballot box.
And John, from back to the raw politics discussion points we're following, the president of the Senate says the legislature should just vote on it. We don't need a referendum. What do you think is more likely?
I think a referendum is more likely for one simple reason. It'll drive turnout for Democrats. Elections are about turnout, getting your people to the polls. And if you have a Heather Mazier, Andy Harris race, turnout could really make the difference getting her elected to Congress.
Our thanks to Professors Cromer and Deedy. Now a new honor for an old friend in the Chesapeake Bay. Sue Copen has the story.
It's an icon in the Bay for nearly 150 years, providing a beacon of light guiding ships large and small. Now the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse just off Annapolis is being honored for that service and its longevity by the U.S. Postal Service. And its supporters couldn't be happier.
Fabulous. Fabulous.
A steady rain was no deterrent for stamp collectors and fans of the lighthouse. They lined up to be among the first to own the stamp, one of 5 featuring mid-Atlantic lighthouses in the Postal Service's latest Forever Stamp series.
It's the only Chesapeake Bay lighthouse on the in the series, and what's so cool about that is it's the 1875 oldest screw pile lighthouse still operating in its original location on the Chesapeake Bay. It's still an active aid to navigation.
Dave Gandel recently published a book all about the Thomas Point Shoal Lighthouse, which he says was not built with the idea it would still be standing after nearly 150 years.
So it's wooden, it's very exposed to the elements. It's 1.25 miles out in the middle of the Chesapeake Bay. It was literally built from a kit.
Getting recognition from the Postal Service is never a sure thing.
We receive approximately 40,000 recommendations every year for different types of commemorative stamps and things of that nature. But we are only able to select a total of 20.
So what is it that makes lighthouses so special?
The mystery, the beauty of them, the history behind them, and what they really stand for, service and history.
Among those celebrating the moment, Jeff McDonald.
My wife and I were huge supporters of the lighthouse. I worked on some preservation projects out there, painting and scraping, and she was trained to be a docent. When they needed money to rebuild the steel structure of the lighthouse, she took it upon herself to organize a gala.
McDonald says this was a day to honor his wife, who died earlier this year, and her dedication to the lighthouse.
She was always a little behind the scenes, organizing, helping, and so she would just be sitting back, watching, and just proud of how far it's come and where it is now and where it's going to be going in the future.
And for Bill Borwegan, who takes visitors out to see the lighthouse, the future is what it's all about.
This will popularize the lighthouse more. And right now we're sold out for the year, but next year hopefully people will have an opportunity to go out and we'll be able to do more tours.
These may be forever stamps, but with a limited run, they won't be around forever. Get them while you can. In Annapolis, Sue Copen for State Circle.
Sue, thank you, and thank you for joining us for State Circle. Have a good night.
This program was made by MPT to serve all of our diverse communities.
Are you a Maryland renter at risk of being evicted due to COVID-19 related issues? Help is on the way with Maryland's Emergency Rental Assistance Program. You may be eligible for assistance in helping to pay current or past due rent and avoid the threat of eviction because of wage loss or illness due to the pandemic. To learn more, visit rentrelief.maryland.gov or call 877-546-5595.
Pre-apprenticeship programs are a way for us to reach out to people in the community and give them an opportunity to learn a trade. It develops skills for those workers, and it also provides skilled laborers for the